What I want to do this afternoon is cover two topics, basically. The first topic is Islamic economics, which I intend to do fairly briefly. And then I'm going to look at the transition into modernity, and we're going to look at both the practice and also the theory I hope to get through. So let's look at what's happening in Islam. The first thing that stands out is that, like the medieval era, which was largely worked on the basis of Christianity, specifically the Catholic religion, Islamic economics is based on the Islamic faith, so it's based on the Quran. And like other natural approaches to economics, it has to do primarily with a small number of fundamental principles to do with property or land, with commerce. We just were talking about just price this morning in the Christian context. Almost exactly the same principle is evident in Islamic economics. And banking, again, comparable to what we're looking at this morning when we're looking at the problem of usury. Let's look at property. The theory, now this was probably going to be familiar for you because it echoes what we found when we looked at indigenous people in our previous session. The God Allah made the land and lends it to his people. Very strong parallels here with what you find in the Christian Old Testament, especially in the book of Leviticus. The idea of humans as sojourners, as travellers, as somebody passing through land. Very similar principle. Now from that comes the idea that it should be organised and used according to the service of God, of Allah. And some particular prescriptions are found in the Quran. An important one is the matter of almsgiving, but also the idea of the extent of private property itself. A very strong notion that property rights in land are limited to the person's own involvement in the land, principally through the application of labour. And so if I go into some tract of land and I plant corn in it, the fact that I've done that planting means that my labour is in the land. Marx will come along later and say that there is an embodiment of my person, of my labour, in the fact that I have ploughed the land and planted the seeds and so on. So there's something of me in there, something that I own. If that's the case, then charging a rent on land becomes conceptually difficult, because I only really own the labour which has been applied to the land, and so when that labour is harvested, then my property interests disappear. And so if I go into a tract of land, I might be able to rent it to you on the basis of the fact that I've sowed the seeds and I want to share in the crop that you collect from it. But beyond that, I don't have any, shall we say, moral right to charge you interest or rent, whatever. I'll just see if I can get that out of the way. And so this idea of rent being prohibited, you find that in a number of unusual expressions today in the Islamic world. In a number of Islamic countries, and I think Iran is amongst them, it's only Iranians who can own land there. And the idea is that if I was to own land in Iran as an investment property, I would be owning something which came from God, came from Allah, so I'd be profiting from something that I really don't have any involvement with. And especially since I'm not a Muslim, that creates other problems. Especially since for a Muslim, one of the religious obligations is almsgiving, which is meant to come from property wealth. If I'm not a Muslim, I don't have that moral obligation, and so in Islam there is an alternate strategy for almsgiving, for people who are not Muslims. And typically that comes through taxing and some other methods. From an outsider's point of view, I may not be a Muslim, so I might like being taxed merely because I'm not a Muslim. But if you understand the logic of it, you find that it has a certain intellectual consistency, in that people that actually follow the religion are motivated because of the practice of the religion to do good things, which somebody such as me, an infidel, would not be motivated to do. So the government then is the authority to cause me to do that through taxes and other things. Some resources, at least in formal Islamic thought, should not be privately owned. And amongst those are mines, waters, forests. And that is quite important, because those things are where you kind of extract things from the land directly. So with a mine, you're taking out of the mine some mineral. Where the mineral come from, Allah made it, and so to take privately that benefit is considered to be immoral. And I was mentioning earlier on that in Iraq became the first Islamic country not to extract its oil, in other words, run a mine, using a government corporation after the American invasion and so on. So it was really only the imposition of, the Anglo culture that ancient approach to property rights was actually, removed, violated, whatever you want to call it. I've mentioned the taxes on infidels, largely because it's considered that the religious motivation, will cause people to use their property wealth for things consistent with the religion. And if I'm not a member of that religion, then for whatever reason I won't have those motivations. And so to get around that, there is often a tax levied. Move from property to commerce. Commerce in Islam, buying and selling things, producing things, employing people. To be licit, it's considered necessary to have what we'll call an active partnership. To simply put in money into a business and say, well, I'll come around next year and collect the profit, is not to be actively involved in the operation of the business, and is considered inappropriate. And so the active engagement would be to contribute labour and or kind of risk and maybe other active forms of involvement, in order to show that you're not simply some disguised usurer, but something actually involved in the profit making, in the income producing aspect of the business. There is a fairly well developed just price concept in Islamic literature, and that goes back to quite sort of some centuries. The just price notion was being perfected intellectually in the West through the medieval period, and you find at that point there's also Islamic scholars developing similar ideas in the East. There's a parallel between Christendom and Islam with respect to most of these economic principles, and you certainly see it in the just price concept. The idea of commerce, of being a merchant, where you've got a guaranteed income, is considered something similar to usury. In other words, taking an income for no reason, and taking an income for no reason is a form of theft. To understand that, we really need to move to usury in Islam, where we find a remarkable parallel. Some observers, some students of this question would say that Islam borrowed many of the ideas regarding commerce from sort of the Christian world, which is also consistent with the history of how the Quran came to be, and where it sort of places Jesus and the Hebrews and so on. And we can see there, quote on the screen, that usury in Islam, it's referred to as riba, is considered to be wrongful, immoral, sinful. Banks still operate in the Islamic world. The distinction is that unlike Western banks that lend risk-free as debt, Islamic banks tend to be understandable as joint venture arrangements. And that gives them a completely different character. It means that if you're a property developer or a property investor, say in our world, and you want extra funds, we would go along to a bank normally and borrow money, so it's a fixed interest, but no involvement in the operation of the business. From the bank's point of view in the West, the bank's only interested in getting back all of their interest and principal. They don't really care whether your business is a success or a failure, so long as they don't lend you so much that even if you go belly up, they can't get their back interest plus their capital. That's one of the reasons why we have lending ratios and things like that. The way that an Islamic bank approaches a borrower is entirely different. From the Islamic bank's point of view, they become joint venturers. They take an active participation in the ventures that they finance. Now, if the business goes really well, the Arab bank will take a larger percentage of income because they'll be participating in the profit. If the business goes badly, they will share the loss. It actually means that the borrower is exposed to considerably less risk because basically the bank is coming in and sharing the risk. So if you're sharing something, you don't have all of it. So you share the risk and share the income. It also means that Islamic banks tend to take a different strategic approach to their customers. If I'm NAB or Combank or Macquarie Bank or what have you, when I analyse some application for debt, I'm simply looking at how much interest can I charge, how much debt can I provide, so that if the worst case happens, I get all my money back, my principal back, and I get all the interest that I'm owed. For a Western bank, risk only begins when they don't get all of their interest and all of their principal. Whereas for the Islamic bank, risk begins as soon as the venture that they finance earns less profit than they're expecting. That means that they're going to take a completely different approach to lending because they're looking at controlling their risks, and obviously they want to make the best use of the funds that they have under management. And so it means that they're going to analyse any financing application entirely differently. Because the bank is usually bigger and has greater analytical resources, if you get a loan from an Arab bank who's practicing this Islamic approach to banking, it really means that they've run the ruler over your venture very carefully, and they are very confident that your business case is pretty close to what they expect to happen at the very least. That means that it reduces risk to you in two ways. Not only are they sharing the risk with you, so whatever risk exists is going to be shared, but in addition to that, you will have a very large and very competent financial analyst, if you like, checking to make sure that you haven't been overly cavalier or optimistic or what have you in your business case in the first place. And so if you come away from an application to an Islamic bank that's been turned down, you should actually breathe a sigh of relief, because you can say, whoa, I nearly went off and started such and such a business. The Islamic bank thinks I'd go bust. They're actually a bit smarter and a bit more sober than me. Aren't I lucky I didn't blow all my money? Right? So there's actually another advantage, if you like. So it's sort of a double benefit from the Islamic business banking approach. That was evident during the global financial crisis, where the financial world, the Western financial world, was really shaken to its roots, and large banks and so on went under. But where was the financial stability in the world? Amongst the Arab banks, because of this character. In addition, because of the approach to money, there is a considerably more efficient use of money and a stability in currency. Now that's an issue that's a little bit too complex to go in here, but in our world, we're quite happy to have aggressive lending driving up markets, simply because while the markets are going up, everyone is smiling. But it produces inflation and a certain amount of instability, because often the enthusiasm of our financial sector, and we see it with property booms all the time, means that the prices are driven up far beyond what is rational, and then of course you get a fall off. Again, you see that in the GFC, which is now a bit of ancient history, but it could well come again. You tend not to have that in Islamic banking world. I'll just mention briefly the gold dinar, which is a unit of currency mentioned in the Quran, and there have been Islamic leaders, like secular leaders, presidents and so on, who have spoken about reintroducing it as a currency for the Islamic world, especially for the use of oil contracts. Hasn't happened yet, for reasons that we could talk about another time. And the debt money problem, I think, is a little bit beyond the time we've got this afternoon. The theory and practice in Islam, unfortunately, there's a bit of a gap there. The theory, when you look at it, has a lot of advantages. The practice, I think in our debate earlier, was noted that not everyone practices their religion as enthusiastically as they'd like people to believe. And so there's a gap between the Islamic theory, the Islamic economic theory, and economic practice in the Islamic world, to the extent that strict Quranic economics are seldom practiced. And often the common practice is preferred to the Quran because of a peculiar practical characteristic that you can actually sort of cheat you can cheat economic systems for a long time before the wheels fall off. And that's what gives us our booms and busts. But they will catch up to you. But during that time, when things are sort of humming along well and things are growing, you can get a lot more bang for your buck, so to speak, from basically cheating. And that sort of produces quite an incentive. There's also pressure from the West in our part of history, that countries like Pakistan, Middle East, many other parts of the Islamic world are being sort of subject to considerable pressure, and that's not simply economic pressure, positive and negative, but also in some cases political and even military pressure, which kind of inclines them away from practicing what their religion would suggest. Okay, I'll leave Islam now and return to the West, because the last slide we looked at was looking at Machiavelli, and I want to come back to Machiavelli and also the changes that were happening as we went from the 15th century into the 16th. This was really a critical time because a number of things were changing in the world around that period. If you look at the year 1500, we mentioned that was about the time of when Machiavelli was making his mark. Machiavelli, by the way, was in prison when he wrote the Prince, but it was actually a strategy for him getting out of prison. But it came with a number of social, political, religious and economic changes. The early modern private property was freed from obligation. And so we went from the feudal system, which we could understand as leasehold property, to freehold, which is really ownership of land which is primarily owned by the state or by a king in a monarchy, to freehold, which is kind of basic, like, look, you know, you're leasing but you don't have to pay the rent. That's what freehold kind of comes from. Now what that meant was that as we did that transition, it really suited those who had some kind of property right. The king wasn't terribly well off because he stopped getting the rent, but those in the middle, they were able to say the intermediate lords, they were used to getting the land rent in one hand and then sort of giving it off to the king, or at least a slice of it to the king on the other hand. And they worked out that by not having to give the share off to the king, then they were better off. And it worked for a while. Basically any distortion, it works a short time, but you end up with problems kind of sneaking into the system later on. The other thing which happened with early modern property was that there was all this very productive, attractive land on which the lords earned no money at all, no rent, what the commons were. Well, when people became a bit sort of selfish, that was the first thing to go, the elimination of the commons. It was argued on the basis of efficiency and the basis of access and the basis of all sorts of things are all good, true and beautiful. The only problem is that it really was, underlying that, it was greed. That was a series of changes which are generally known as the enclosures, and we'll be talking about them later. The curious thing about the elimination of the commons is that it introduced into Europe for the first time in roughly 1,000 years the problem of unemployment. We had unemployment, you remember, at late Rome. The soldiers who came home found they'd lost their farm and sort of marched down to Rome, bread and circuses, all that. Okay, that was the first time we really had unemployment in Western history. The second time was when the commons were being enclosed and used to earn rent privately, and we had unemployment coming in again. We didn't really have unemployment during the medieval period at all. Now, also, because you had no longer a floor under wages, not only did you have unemployment, but you also had pressures to run down wages. And so employed people were earning less and less. And this happened relatively quickly. We already talked about Machiavelli. It's just another slide basically covering the same kind of thing. The important thing is probably this third point, the gap between appearance and reality. Now, philosophically, that has given us the foundations of modern philosophy. Modern philosophy is based on an interest in appearance, what we can sense with our five senses. The philosophy previous to that, basically the philosophical system that undergirded the medieval period, especially through thinkers like Thomas Aquinas and St. Bonaventure, was based on what's known as moderate realism, or realism in general. Realism is based on the belief, the premise, that I can know things with certainty, and I can know things that may not be material. To give you an idea, and I'm not sure if I've mentioned this in class before, we can know things that don't have any material manifestation. For instance, in economics, there's a rather famous quote, and I can't remember the source of it, I really should, and it basically runs along the lines of, what do economists economize on? They economize on love. Now, that's all very poetic and lovely. Can you measure love? Can you see it? Can you sense it with a scientific instrument? No, you can't. Does it exist? Can we know it? Well, I think we can. And most of the cultures that we've dealt with, whether they're the tribal cultures of indigenous people, whether the ancients when they're in times of ascendancy, whether it's a civilized influence that was running behind the medieval and Middle Ages, all is based on a relationship between people which at least has a certain dose of love in it. But you can't measure it. When you move into modernity, it's based on appearance. So the only things I can know is what I can see and touch. So things like honesty, I can't actually see, I can measure indirectly. There are other things, though, that you can't see, that we almost take for granted. And yet, in modernity, we sort of accept them, even though they formally are things that are totally unknowable. If we can only know things that come through our senses, can I know the number 2? Has anyone ever seen 2? Smelt it? Okay. Heard it? Okay. There might be, well, there are 3 microphones, but there might be 2 young ladies sitting down here towards the front. But I'm seeing the young ladies, I'm not seeing 2, am I? Okay. And so already all of mathematics disappears amongst Machiavellian modern thought. But modernity is based radically on appearance being more important than reality. And that will sort of lead us off into philosophy, which is, again, too much for what we've got time for today. But it illustrates the way that underneath this new culture is an entire way of thinking. And it's a way of thinking that says certain things are unknowable. One of the things which is unknowable, because you can't sense it with your 5 senses, is what is behind Islamic economics and behind the motivating principles for the medieval period. It's behind the motivating principles for all of our indigenous people. And that is an understanding that everything that is comes from some immaterial source, some creator. And so in modern philosophy, one of the necessary conclusions of modern philosophy is that we can't know God. Religion becomes totally irrelevant. And so we move into an area where the culture is defined by something other than a religious foundation, which makes it sort of fundamentally different to most of these cultures that we've been studying so far. It gives rise to a new ethic. The new ethic is that people are self-determined creatures, and everything we do is nothing more than self-determined action. Society will flourish by an association of self-interested individuals. Now, this is almost a statement of what you read usually in the introductory chapter of any economics textbooks. What is economics studying? Homo economicus, self-interested individuals, self-interested rational individuals. Now, that ethic ultimately suits those people who are strong, who are basically able to go into some competition situation and win. And so if I'm confident of being able to do that, then I'll be far happier with the Machiavellian ethic than with something else. Just one little aside. We talk a lot about competition, and occasionally I'll be using that word. It's interesting because the word competition comes from a Latin root, 2 words, com, which means with, and second one, petition, has to do with to work. And so competere really means to work with. The medieval idea of competition, competere, was working with people, working with other guildsmen and so on. In the Islamic world, the idea of entrepreneurship, illicit entrepreneurship, is where the financier is an active partner, is working with the entrepreneur. So what we're talking about, this active partnership in Islamic economics, is also working with, competere, rather than competition, which is working against. Now, even in that word is this idea of self-interest and of opposition. It becomes the foundation for what Marx will codify a few centuries later as the conflict theory in Marxist social theory. I haven't left anything behind there. How does this pay out in practice? As a result of a couple of factors. One is the development of the technology for long-distance transport. Basically, ships are able to sail against the wind and so on. And this ethic of self-interested individuals comes basically the British Empire. One of the curiosities about the British Empire is that it was built initially on piracy. People like Sir Francis Drake, who sort of goes down in history as really one of the key players in sort of setting England on the map, basically spent most of his spare time beating up on other people, especially other boats. He was a pirate. And the idea of the British, well, the word escapes me. Yeah, the word escapes me. But basically, it's piracy, and that idea of piracy on the waves was sort of extended into the exploitation of other lands as well. If you have your ability to sort of travel long distances fairly safely, you sort of take in a certain amount of military capacity. The Spanish did it in South America. The British did it over the rest of the world. And there's this exploitation of the world for your own benefit. And so what we're talking about on a local level with masters exploiting their local communities, selling gloves or what have you, we're also seeing on a national or international basis with countries basically applying the same approach to the way that they spread their empire. I don't think we'll go into that. I think we don't have enough time. Now, we've mentioned the enclosures. I think we've probably covered most of those points. The enclosures, if you read about the enclosures, often they'll be described in terms related to economic efficiency. By enclosing the commons, you're able to use the land more productively. Just about everyone in this class will eventually be familiar with a paper titled The Tragedy of the Commons. Now, you will have come across that idea. It's used as a cliche. I recommend that you read the article in full, because the article in full is a little bit more complex. It's actually to do with a completely different topic to what we normally take from it. But it also is coming from an anthropology, an attitude to treating your fellows, which suits the modern mind, but it doesn't suit the mentality, the anthropology that was found in the medieval period where the commons actually flourished. If you've got the attitude of treating people socially, the commons actually work quite well. If you've got the attitude of taking as much as you can with the least input, then the tragedy of the commons kind of follows. So the tragedy of the commons is curious because it does work when you've got a modern mentality. And you tend to find this with a lot of the criticisms of the earlier era. When we're looking at the guilds, the guilds can be seen as really sort of operating in two completely different worlds. The early guilds in a world where everyone was motivated to basically relate socially to the people around them, and then the guilds in the other world, the latter world, the pre-modern world, where you had the same institution, but the brains, the thinking, the mentality, the ethics of the people who are running the guilds was completely different. So you had the same institution, but the human bodies, they looked the same. One were sort of more like indigenous people with a brotherhood kind of motivation. The others were something completely different. Okay. The short answer to everything on this slide is that the enclosures began, they ran over a period of centuries, and during that time two things happened. The commons disappeared, but the other thing was that the land was used more intensively and fenced off, and sort of rents were basically driven up. Okay. In the area of commerce, the idea of just price fell, and we went through a series, or what had become a series of varieties of capitalism. Now, I used to run an exercise for this class where I break the class up into the various components of the economy, and we'd start with the medieval commercial ethic, which was just price, and then we would allow the economy, the various parts, whether they're the manufacturers, the wholesalers, retailers, and so on, to adjust their ethic to the modern world. And what we actually saw, and I won't do it in this class, we don't have time, is that in the medieval ethic of just price, it's the final retailer who is actually sort of sitting at the boundary between the consumer, who might be prepared to pay more, and their supplier, who will be supplying at a just price. And there's a pressure, if you like, on the retailer to actually run up their prices. Okay, that's the first pressure. Once the retailer starts to do that, then it tends to flow back through the supply chain. If the retailer is making all its profit because the wholesaler is selling them at a just price, and then the retailer is selling into the consumer market at what the consumer is willing to pay, right, what now is considered to be the value, the wholesaler then puts his prices up and basically pushes the retailer's profit down. And once the wholesaler is making all this profit, then the manufacturer comes along and he says, oh, I used to supply to the wholesaler at a just price. Now the wholesaler is making all this profit. So the manufacturer will put up his prices. And the whole thing basically sort of filters back through the system. This is sort of parallel to what we see in the development of capitalism. The first form of capitalism is known as mercantile capitalism, and it flourished around the 16th century. It had to do with the merchants who suddenly were able to sail around the world in these new generation of ships. And because they were able to buy things very cheap, so off in foreign lands, bring them back to Europe and sort of sell them for a whole lot of money, they became fabulously wealthy. Now, mercantile capitalism worked for a time. It had a particular sort of whole economics behind it, which we don't have enough time to go into. It had to do with the idea that countries belong, that the more treasure they were able to bring in, the better the country would be. The curious thing is, though, that if I'm able to, let's say, get textiles, say from India or somewhere a long way away, and they come in cheap, what's that going to do to your local textile industry? Not going to look good, is it? No. And so even though it's bringing money and treasure into the country, eventually the country will end up, at least with parts of itself, looking rather sad. And of course, if you're getting large-scale unemployment or a lowering of wages in your country, at least for the textiles industry and so on, those former textile workers now don't have as much money to go and spend on all the other things, and so the economy in other places starts to look a bit sour as well. And then you might sort of go off to other parts of the world where you're going to be buying in all the other resources as well. And so mercantile capitalism works quite well initially, but eventually it becomes limited because it needs sources of, or two things, sources of cheap products, and it needs destinations where people are able to spend, a fair bit of money, which is kind of roughly what's happening now, say, between us and China, in that we're getting things from a cheap source, and right now we have relatively high wages in Australia, but this will equalise out over a period of time, and so it's likely we're going to all end up having the same incomes as the people who are actually making our goods for us. There is a belief that those who are winning from the system, that wealth will then sort of trickle down through the rest of the society. The difficulty, unfortunately, is that if the profits are all being made by a very small number of people who tend to be earning so much that they don't spend it all on consumption, and a lot of people lower down in the economic system are not earning anything at all, and those people would previously have been spending a lot on consumption, your overall national consumption actually goes down. Yes, sir? It could, especially taxing non-labour income-producing activities, right? And so it tends to improve that. And so and you see, this is the problem with income tax. That income tax almost does the exact opposite. That even if I have a progressive income tax scale, it seldom completely captures the relative income value, if you like, okay? Even if I'm paying, let's say, 90% income tax, if I'm earning $10 million a week or something, who cares if I pay 95% of tax, right? I'm still making an awful lot of money, above what I need, which is not going to be put into the economy, okay? But yeah, you're right. And that's one of the reasons why Henry George's land tax idea is so effective, because you're not taxing land. You're not taxing labour. You're taxing land. Okay. Again, we're a bit short on time, so I won't be able to go into as much detail as I'd like to. But an interesting or an important phenomenon that came into the West was trade cycles, economic cycles, we'd call them. Since the 16th century, about 1540 I think was the first one, we've had a major economic downturn roughly twice a century. Up until about 1930, they were happening about every 48 years. So if you go back in time from 1930, back 48 years, about 1890, then 1830, dum-de-dum-de-dum-de-dum-de-dum, back to about 1540, I think it was. Right? They are very, very regular. They've become known now as Kondratiev cycles, and some of you might be familiar with Kondratiev cycles. Kondratiev was a Russian economist who identified them first around the 1920s. Kondratiev was in communist Russia at the time. He predicted the Great Depression. His greatest error was that he was right. His greatest problem was that the Russians wanted to pin the Great Depression on the failures of capitalism, and so Kondratiev was sent off to the salt mine somewhere. We never saw him again. But Kondratiev, if you read anything on Kondratiev, it's very, very interesting, very, very insightful economist, and it's been applied to other sociological areas as well. These 50-year trade cycles. And you see the trade cycles themselves are in a sense a symptom that something's wrong. A healthy economy doesn't have this kind of cycling because it's got the checks and balances. It's got sort of some mechanism in it which causes people, members of the community, of the society, to actually apply the self-restraint, not to have this excessive boom and bust kind of mentality. It's hard for us to see it in our culture. When we look at manufacturing through the modern era, we're already seeing wages being suppressed through the 1400s, in the 15th century. Wages overall were suppressed, partly because of the lack of the commons, partly because of the demise of the guilds. That was manifest in terms of longer working hours. You see, if you think of the production unit, today we think of the productive unit as the individual. I go to work, you go to work, da-da-da-da-da. Okay? Realistically, people don't live forever. Okay? When you're your age, you probably think that they do. Technically, old blokes die. I might be here next week. But you guys, it's not going to happen to you, right? And so there's a lot of decisions that you make and whatnot that are kind of based on that basis. I've got one of my daughters is just turned 30, and she hasn't kind of worked out yet. But one day she's not going to be here. How do we keep a community going over a long period of time? Well, we have to have something which Marx coined the expression or described as social reproduction. Okay? We know what regular reproduction is. Social reproduction is when the society is regenerating itself generation on, generation off, right? What that means is that our economic thinking needs to be configured not to the individual, not me being a worker, you being a worker, you being a worker, but rather to the social unit, which is at the very least mum, dad and 2 children. Okay, because the 2 children are going to be mums and dads and they're going to have 2 children and da-da-da-da-da, on it goes. If you don't have an economic unit which is self-sustainable, so mum and dad are able to have their 2 kids, are able to turn into parents, are able to have their 2 kids, da-da-da-da-da, it turns out that that 2 kids actually is about 2.1 kids. And the reason for that is that not all children end up getting married, and sort of some of them ride motorbikes like I was a survivor, but a lot aren't so fortunate. Okay, so you need that extra 0.1 of a child, right? So ladies, you've got an idea of what your game plan is now, 2.1 children. Okay. Below that level, you'll find that society will tend to wind down. Above it, it tends to expand. And economically, that's what we need to be working on, a system which is able to actually produce that. When you've got an economic system where mum and dad both have to be working really, really long hours, which is what was happening, say, through the 1700s, early 1800s and so on, and anyone who's kind of basically out of nappies is also going to be working, it really means that the income from that economic unit has been pushed down so far as to be no longer sustainable, to use modern terms. Okay? And this idea of social reproduction just cannot happen. And so we need to look more at wages, the basically income situation for a family unit. And during this period, that was being run down quite considerably. You also had some other arguments, if you like, or tussles, competition sort of going on during this period into modernity. Particularly the tensions between the manufacturers, or the secondary industry we might call it, and the landowners. If I was running a factory and I was going to employ a whole lot of people, I want to pay them the lowest wages possible. Part of what enables me to pay low wages is if food is cheap. If food is cheap, it means that farmers aren't making much money. And if farmers aren't making much money, they're not able to pay the rural landlords very much rent. In England at this time, there was a tension between the manufacturers, the people that owned businesses, and the landlords that tended to own the farms. Basically, the landlords, as a group, wanted food to be expensive because they made more money, earned more rent, whereas the manufacturers wanted food to be cheap. That erupted in a political tussle in what was called the Corn Laws. About this time, America was being settled and it was found to be agriculturally very productive. That was all very nice. They were able to bring their corn over to England and other parts of Europe, sell it really cheap. The manufacturers thought it was a great idea, and so they were quite happy for American corn to come into England and be sold cheap. But the landlords, the rural landlords, they wanted just the opposite. And in fact, they passed these corn laws, which basically were kind of, import tariffs, basically, import restrictions. And so there was this tussle. It indicates the strength of land with all of these kind of questions. We then move from mercantile capitalism into industrial capitalism. We had the era of industrial capitalism roughly for about 300 years, something like that. Now we're sort of moving into something else. You right?
Yeah, I did my assignment on this and I haven't.
You can go and have a coffee.
Yeah, I'm just watching it all come up in here. I'm happy that half of it's what I've got in here.
That's what I want to hear.
I'm laughing.
Good on you. Yeah. Okay, yeah. Through all of human history, the development of tools and technology has always been seen as a good thing, largely because tools and technology help the manufacturer. It's a lot better to give somebody a semi-trailer than a wheelbarrow. They're able to carry a lot more stuff. But it's also possible to use technology as a weapon. And that's pretty much what happened through the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution was where machinery, and especially machinery which was too expensive for the individual, the ordinary family unit, to be able to afford. You know, I doubt if many people's family in this room would be able to afford a textile mill. You might be able to afford a spinning wheel or a hand loom, something like that. But to have some giant kind of factory basically outside your resources. If you move to doing all of your textiles, your spinning and your weaving, using huge machines, then what it means is that control and influence over that industry moves from the people with their hand looms and the spinning wheels and stuff. They lose control, power, economic influence, and it also goes, and they end up having to be employees of these huge mills where they're paid very, very little. That means that the incentive, the fancy profits, move from the merchants to the manufacturers, because the manufacturers are now in control of this extra power, if you like. And so technology becomes a weapon. And that's largely what gives us, you know, the Oliver Twist stories, what Charles Dickens was kind of militating about. Dickens, you might be aware, would not see himself as a writer. He was actually a political activist. He was a member of the House of Commons, and he was trying to get his fellow middle-class Englishmen to understand the conditions of the ordinary people, which was pretty miserable. He wanted his novels to get people thinking, like the people who could actually vote and affect English law, to actually give working people a better chance. We've got now his novels, Oliver Twist and all the rest of them, and we've kind of forgotten why they were written. Curious thing about all of this is that it appears that there is a tussle between industry and labour. And this is something that was later going to be sort of picked up by Marx, where Marx complained about the ownership of the factors of production. And he sort of basically lumped all factors of production apart from labour into one basket, and he said, they're bad and labour is good, and away he went. What he ignored was the chap in the middle in this cartoon, who was really the landowner, because the landowner, regardless of what happened with industry and labour, when the factory owner ran down wages, that gave the landowner the power, the ability to push up rents. And so the manufacturer would be there, and he would work longer hours or get the standard of living of his employees to be pushed down. And he thinks, oh, that's good, I'm going to make a nice profit, I'm going to be just as wealthy as the landowner. And the landowner comes along behind him and says, oh, I'm glad you're making all this extra profit now. By the way, the rents are going to go up. And so the poor old industrialist, while he thought that he was actually, top of the pile, was in fact the sandwich in the middle. And that's a process which tends to have continued, to the extent that Fred Harrison, when he was writing, about 25 years ago, a book called The Power in the Land, he made this observation that if you were to put the 100 richest men in England into a room and just look at who's there, this is in the late 1800s, you could be excused for thinking that the Industrial Revolution had never happened. Right. And we get told the story about how, Oliver Twist is all about the dreadful factories and the dreadful factory owners. Right. But the factory owners weren't the people who ended up with all the money in their pockets. It was the landowners. So I think Harrison's point is really quite reasonable, and it continues to the present day. That you might make a modest fortune doing this, that and the other, but if you want to make a really serious fortune, you end up sort of putting your spare profit sort of into property wealth. Okay, I want to move into looking at some of the themes, some of the ideas, some of the theory. We did a little bit of that when we looked at Machiavelli. You see, what happens is that when you introduce a new way of doing business, especially one which suits you, Machiavelli was trying to get the prince to have a better deal so he could get out of prison, it always has to be built on a philosophical foundation, a system of thinking, a system of principles, right? We had the introduction of modern philosophy through Machiavelli, which is a system of ideas, and as sort of pointed out, those ideas basically sort of turning against all of the thinking of the previous era. But those ideas needed to be formalised over time, and they tended, most of that happened during the 18th century, the 1700s. That period is known as the Enlightenment because it's considered to be the period of, intellectual development.
I don't know if this is a really dumb question, but you see the guy that faked his death?
You see the guy
The
that
faked his death?
makes?
Machiavelli?
Sorry, just couldn't hear the last part.
Did he fake his death?
Did he fake his death?
Yeah.
Oh, that's a really interesting question. I don't know. That's one part of his story I couldn't tell you the answer. It wouldn't totally surprise me. Machiavelli was good at faking a lot of things. Yeah, okay. Now we're going to be talking about some 18th century thinkers, and these are fairly important. In France, you had the Enlightenment thinkers, Voltaire, Rousseau, and a handful of others. They're largely associated very often with the French Revolution. In England, you have almost their counterparts. We're going to be talking about a couple of them, but there are a number of others as well. This period was known as the Enlightenment. It was really the flourishing of the modern way of thinking about things. It was the formalisation of this way of looking where appearance is more important than reality. The only things that I can know is what I can sense with my five senses or maybe an electronic instrument. Okay? And if that's the only stuff that I know, then my whole way of thinking is based far more on appearance. It's actually all perspective. It's all guesswork. Because, in a sense, I can't directly know causality. I can know things often happen in a particular order. This afternoon I'm expecting the sun to go down. Tomorrow morning I'm expecting it to come up again. It's always done it in the past. Do I know what's going to happen tomorrow? Don't know. Right? There's always this theoretical, hypothetical kind of element to it. Modern science is interesting because it's considered to be the arbiter of all knowledge, but in fact science, like natural science, supplies no knowledge at all. We have the theory of relativity. We don't have the knowledge of relativity. We don't have the laws. Even the things that we call laws in physics are in fact only theories. Newton's laws of physics, I'm very fond of them, are only actually theories, and they were overcome by relativity, or at least that's the theory we're working on at present. So it's sort of curious that modernity is based, or says that the only things we can know with that come from our senses, but in fact it leads to a position where we can actually conclude nothing. Okay. The period of the Enlightenment is also associated with liberty, and this notion of liberty has become an important theme in our modern world today. And I want to explore that a little bit. In the classical time, in the pre-modern era, freedom and liberty was pursued because it enabled us to do things better. And so it was freedom to achieve, freedom to perfect. Okay? To give you an idea, we might give an athlete a certain amount of freedom. We might say, you don't have to go to work, you're going to be an athlete, you're going to represent Australia in the Olympic Games. So I'm not going to send you to work. Okay? There are people in this class who get let off class so they can go and play sport in sort of other parts of Australia. Fantastic. They're given this extra liberty. Okay? What do they do with that time? Well, they get up early in the morning, long time before I get up in the morning. and they sort of run around, wear themselves out. When they sit down for breakfast, you and I might just sit down and have bacon and eggs or croissants or whatever we feel like. Okay, these sportsmen, what do? They sit down and a few pills and, I don't know, a bucket of water or something, right? And they apply this extraordinary discipline. They order themselves very precisely because they know that only by applying this restriction to themselves, this order, they will have the freedom to excel in their sport. Kind of a paradox. Another way of looking at it, which used to appeal to me when I was a bit younger, was that if I have a motor car and I want it to go really well, I don't know if any of you blokes or ladies perhaps are interested in motor racing or club sports or what have you, but what do you do to an engine if you want it to perform really well? Well, the old term that was around when I was interested in this stuff was you blueprint it. And what that means is you take every part of the engine and you say, well, the design of this allows this part to be this size plus or minus a bit. Okay? To blueprint it means you say it's going to be this size. You make it exact. And the more perfectly circular you make all your bearings, no allowance for little lumps and bumps, the smoother that bearing will work, the more power that engine will produce. And so the more perfect you make it, the more you limit it to its design, the more efficient it becomes. And so you have the freedom for that thing to actually excel, to produce more power. All of these places, you see, where liberty is the freedom to excel, the freedom to do whatever it takes to do things better. Okay? That's true freedom. That's the notion of freedom which gives us the liberal arts, where it was considered that the leaders in a society should have the freedom, the intellectual freedom, not to become lunatics, right? But to learn what it is that is the answer to all these big questions. Right? And to a certain extent, you guys sitting in the class right now have got that. In another situation, you might be at TAFE or something and running around too busy to actually sort of come along and contemplate the history and the meaning of property and valuation and all this stuff that we're doing today. Right. Okay, what I'm doing there is just giving you an idea of what this very positive liberty means, and whether it's a motorcycle engine or whether it's an Olympic athlete. Okay, real liberty is this freedom to excel, this freedom to be perfect, the freedom to be the best you can be, the freedom to make decisions which will show you as either better or truer, or in the aesthetic world, say in art, the most beautiful. Okay? That's what comes from freedom. Now, there's a slightly different definition of liberty, and that's the definition of liberty that sort of came into vogue in the Enlightenment period. And that was that liberty, well, what's liberty? It's freedom. What's freedom? Freedom from restraint. Okay? Not putting a door on my doghouse. Just letting me do whatever I feel like. As long as it doesn't hurt anybody, let me do it. Now, within that liberty, the absence of restraint is pretty much the definition of liberty that we have today. And we talk about a liberal today, we might be thinking of a left-winger. Okay, and what's a left-winger? Somebody who doesn't want to work but still wants the government to pay them, right? So I've got the freedom from work, mate. I don't want to be restrained by this job business. I just want the state to keep me going, mate. I'm a liberal, That's really good. Oddly enough, a liberal, certainly in Britain, so a British liberal, and liberty was actually started by the Brits, this idea of liberty, is the freedom to be able to, have a free mercantile relationship with you. And I really like that idea because, I'm Telstra and you need to sort of buy a phone, right? And I want the freedom to be able to rip you off sideways. And so the right wingers really like liberty as well. To be a British liberal is to be a right winger. Now, in a sense, you're wanting the same thing, a freedom from restraint, freedom from, influence, a freedom from government control. Today, we've got a political party which is named after Enlightenment liberty. Okay? And what does it want? It wants the freedom, basically, to run down the working conditions of employees and sort of sell all our industry sort of, off to the highest bidder and all that sort of carry on. The interesting thing about this is that Enlightenment liberty, this absence of restraint, this absence of a social conscience, manifests on the two extremes of our political understanding. Historically, the Brits started liberty or liberal thinking, and so to be a liberal in the United Kingdom these days is still to be a right-winger. And so if you're really liberal in your thinking, you will tend to vote Conservative. Okay, how are we going there? In economics, it's the freedom for everyone to maximise their own income, and then the community as a whole will be wealthy. Okay, that's pretty much the ethic, if you like, that lives behind capitalism. Now that sounds like a good idea. If you make yourself as wealthy as you can be, and you, 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 okay, aren't we all going to be wealthy? Well, if there's an infinite number of people out there to be wealthy against, yes, that's true. But if our country, or even the world, is made up of just the people in this room, then it means if I'm making myself wealthy, relatively speaking, one of you guys, or maybe more, have to be getting poorer. And if I have a system that just puts us all into the room and turns out the lights and sort of see who's kind of on top at the end, okay, you'll usually find that only one or two people will end up on top. Everybody else will be exploited. And so this ethic, which we find now at the very cornerstone of Adam Smith's, there's a picture there, is economics, actually pretty much ensures that the great majority of the community are going to be enslaved. And so the liberal ethic gives way to social, quasi-enslavement. The other chap on the other side is David Hume. Okay, ultimately it's a form of ethical anarchy. When we look at Enlightenment England, where we're looking at the period through the 1700s, that's the period when Australia was settled. Why did England sort of send out colonists to Australia? Primarily to take the pressure off their prisons. Why were their prisons so full? Because Englishmen, under Enlightenment liberty, were so poor in general, the great majority of them, they had to steal to survive. To keep their children alive, they could not rely on their wages. They had to steal an apple or a loaf of bread or what have you, and you steal a loaf of bread from somebody because your kid's starving, and you find yourself on a boat over to New South Wales in chains. So in a sense, Australia is a bit of a sad indictment on the virtue of Enlightenment liberty. The curious thing about it is that it produces high GDP per capita. And if you look at people sort of defending capitalism, they'll say, look, the most successful economic countries, most examples of economic success are under capitalism. That's exactly right. If you define success as GDP per capita. But if it turns out that the great majority of that GDP is going to a small number of capita, and the rest of the capita are sitting there in abject poverty, there's something else going on. Okay, so you have to scratch a little bit deeper. We've talked about Australia and so on. During that time, through the 1700s and into the 1800s, we end up sort of getting to the time or the period of Charles Dickens. He was trying to appeal to the English intelligentsia, their conscience, and his project, if you like, was to use conscience to go and sort it out, get them to sort of make decisions that were going to help the average Englishman. It turned out to be moderately successful. You have Wilberforce and a couple of other names during that period that did wonderful, wonderful things. But generally it wasn't that effective. In the mid-1800s, you had people being hung because they were so desperate that even though they had jobs, they were willing to go to the gallows as a result of industrial organisation. You had people saying, look, we're workers, we need to get together to get a better wage so that we can survive. And the English factory owners said, no, you can't organise, you have to approach us on a one-to-one basis. If you organise, you're breaking the law. They had the government behind them because they ran the House of Commons and to a certain extent the House of Lords. And so when they organised out of pretty much abject desperation, they got wheeled off, put in prison and eventually hung. That was pretty sad. But they're willing to do it. And if enough people are willing basically to be martyrs for a cause, then it's a pretty good indication that something is going to happen. And it did. The only problem was that the reaction was a little bit sort of too far the other way. And it sort of ended up giving us socialism. By the late 1800s, specifically 1890, you ended up with the acceptance of trade unions. Interestingly, there was the Pope in the 1890s, Pope Leo XIII, wrote an encyclical, like a letter to the world, authorising industrial organisation of industrial associations and so on. And so generally the balance sort of came back to a certain extent. When we look at industrial, I'm not going to read this, I'm going to have this circulated, these slides, so you can read it. But it's a pretty dismal kind of thing. It's basically a little story. It's just a quote out of a book, and it describes the circumstances of miners primarily, and the way that people, in particular women here, are really being degraded, something absolutely dreadful, as a result of being employees. It's a form of slavery, even though they're free, at least notionally. You basically have the freedom to either sort of take slave kind of wages or starve to death, you know. That's freedom. The other liberalism. Okay, mentioned English liberalism as basically right-wing liberalism, free market and so on, free access to property, freehold and so on. That extreme right-wing liberty gave rise to a reflection which has now become the other political pole. And it was first enunciated by a chap by the name of Proudhon in the early 19th century, early 1800s. And he gave us a nice little one-liner. It makes property economists kind of shudder a little bit, still does with me. Property is theft. Proudhon looked at the way that the property owners in England were using their property rights to exploit most Englishmen, and that was his conclusion. And that was really the beginnings of socialism. And you have socialism kind of growing in strength through the 19th century. Proudhon, Marx, and a bunch of others. It was initiated largely by the failure of liberal economics. Liberal economics there is right-wing liberal economics. And also, the human fact that people in economies are actually flesh and blood. They're not homo economicus. Okay, that's just a bunch of facts. When we go to Marx, we find that Marx developed a systematic theory of society, and it's important, I think, to engage with Marx and to understand what he's on about, because he gets a lot of things right, but unfortunately he makes a few mistakes, mainly in his conclusions. His philosophical or his anthropological theory probably comes more from Hegel, who was a philosopher. I don't have enough time to go into Hegelian thought, but Hegelian thought had a lot to do with actually a theological supposition. Hegel believed that God split himself into two, roughly, because he was lonely. And one half of God became creation, and the other was God. And God used that in order to develop a relationship and sort of all sorts of complicated interactions with that. And it was all at the level of the supernatural. Marx didn't like the supernatural. He's a curious fellow. He started life, he came from a Jewish family. He had a bit of an infatuation with Christianity for a while, so he's a Protestant for a while. If you read his later poetry especially, it's quite explicit that he sold his soul to the devil. And a lot of his poetry is really quite explicit. It's kind of a little bit creepy. You do find similar things though. Proudhon also was a Satanist. And it's interesting because you read Proudhon's work on economics, basically where he comes out with that quote about property being theft. And the very first couple of pages of his economics book is all about the way that God doesn't exist. And you read it and you think, well, what's going on here? I thought I was reading economics. So there's sort of tie-ups here that normally we try to sort of sanction off, but in the longer history of thought, you find that you can't do that nearly so tidily. Okay, Marxist socialism, drawn from Hegel. If God has split himself into two parts and is actually relating, like I'm trying to work out who I am by sort of talking to you, and I want to see if I'm bigger than you, then you're getting into like a conflict situation, right? You've got this adversarial kind of dynamic built into the very foundations of what exists. Marx brought that down into the material level. So he said that he turned Hegel on his head, and he said, well, Hegel's idealism, working at the level of ideas of the supernatural is not there according to Marx, and so on the material level, all interaction is built on conflict. And so every interaction, I am here talking to you because I want to make myself feel better, so I feel really great sort of coming out as a lecturer. Okay, you come along because you want to rip off my ideas or something. So every relationship is a relationship of tension, of conflict, of adversary, of trying to overpower the other. You don't have authority, you only ever have tyranny. You apply that, say, in the family, and you end up with feminism. And if you do enough feminist reading, you find that basically all of feminism makes sense once you assume that family relationships, when people go down walk down the aisle together or what have you, it's actually the beginning of a war. Now, in some families, unfortunately, that really does happen, but you rather hope that there are a couple where it doesn't, It's all fairly dismal. But this adversarial idea that comes from Hegel gives you this theory of history. Now, Marx did some absolutely brilliant history, right? He sat himself in the British Library and pulled out old copies of the Times and looked at history, and he read other history and so on. He said, look, you read history, and what you find on the page of history? This war, that battle, this king sort of toppling that king. It's all examples of people fighting with each other. What's the conclusion from that? The whole of human existence is a fight. And you see it to a certain extent in economics. Okay. Marx's thought fits pretty well into modern philosophy. If Machiavelli was there advocating that people sort of in their minds know what right and wrong is and then sort of manage it to best advantage, it means you've got this sort of tension, if you like, between ideas and reality. You've then got a tension between the prince and his people. There's no longer an organic family kind of relationship. You see it in economics. And Marx would say that all cultural institutions, religion is totally there for the oppression of the gullible. Everything sits on the basis of the economy. Education is all there to further some form of exploitation, either political or economic. And so all of institutions, your entertainment industry, your cultural industry, your art, they're all there in one way or another to further some element of conflict. And ultimately, because we're living, or according to Marx, everything is purely material, then the eventual measuring stick, the reference point, is always economic. Because when we think in an entirely materialistic scale, what can you value if it's not material? And what's the value of anything material if it isn't what humans want it to be? Okay, there's no value in a sunset unless it's the value of someone watching the sunset. And if I can organise it so I own the sunset and I sell it to you in some way, I'm exploiting you, for, if you like, the value of the sunset. So there's nothing in the world that doesn't exist for some economic purpose. It's a curious structure, but it kind of has an intellectual integrity to it. Talked about those. For our purposes, property is a tool for oppressing the workers. So it comes back to the idea of properties and property being theft from Proudhon. It also fits to a certain extent with Ricardo. That's a little bit subtle, but certainly Ricardo is often seen as a proto-socialist in his thinking. Now, it's kind of difficult to do that because labelling people as either left or right is actually really, really limited, because there's an awful lot that just doesn't fit the box, right? Whether that happens or not. Okay, we'll just look at some of the elements in Marxist thought. The fallacies: private property is always oppressive, relationships are always conflict-based, and state ownership is necessarily the solution to all of our problems. We can moderate those by another set which I think are a lot more robust. Sort of stands in the middle to a certain extent. Yes, property may be oppressive, it's not always, and it's possible to have property rights systems that aren't oppressive. Same thing with relationships. There are marriages that aren't based on conflict, go to war, and so on. Taking an idea to over far is always a
Sorry, Gareth, before we wrap up Marxism, I just wanted to clarify something. My understanding of Marxism is the view is that the world is conflicting with each other, different interest groups, but I understood it as groups rather than individuals conflicting with each other. I just noticed that you focused, I don't know, I rather understood it as being, they thought that it was groups competing with each other, and rather than individuals. They believe that individuals should think as a ethnic group or racial group or whatever, and therefore they share a group thing, and so it's rather group thinking.
Yep. Now you make a good point.
Like a hive mind. Sort of
Yep.
rather than,
Yep. No, it's a fair point, and I think it's a good thing to look at. Okay. Now, when you think about those groups, okay, within the individual groups, how are they relating? Okay? This is where there is a common contrast between the economic relationships at the different scales of our own life. Okay. And I'm going to sort of take a parallel with what you're suggesting there. We're going to sort of basically expand it up to a large level. I would say, I think I may have mentioned this in class before, that most people, let's say when you guys have finished work, let's imagine in 10 years' time, okay, most of you will be working, most of you will probably be married or in some sort of stable relationship or something, and you'll sort of happily wake up in the morning and you'll sort of, go out the door. Well, let's imagine you've got sort of a couple of kids and all that sort of carry on, right? That might be a long way off in your thinking right now, but, 10 years' time, something might be different. Okay. I would say that in that situation, your world will actually be living between two completely different economic systems. Okay? You wake up in the morning and you go down for breakfast. Okay? Say your kids wake up for breakfast, they come down. Do they put the credit card down on the table? Hey mum, sort of what's breakfast work this morning? And is mum going to say, oh yeah, what's it worth to you? Right? And you do a little bit of an interaction there, and eventually you sort of come up with a number and sort of put the money in the slot, whatever, and away you go. Okay? You don't do that in a family, do you? Right? And there are even situations where, I mean, one of my daughters, oh dear, she was learning to drive. She was 16 and a half or something. She knew how to drive. I had a really nice sports car at that stage. And she decided to go and visit one of her friends at 3 o'clock in the morning, right? She had L plates. And I discovered that when people write off motor cars and they don't have licenses, your insurance doesn't cover you. And so she was at school. She had, I don't know, over $1,000 worth of fines. And I didn't have any motor car, right? And I didn't have the insurance. It was a bit awkward. Now, did I sort of put her into hock? Is he still sort of paying back like a HEX debt? No. I mean, at the time I was a little bit cross with her. But I love her dearly. She's my daughter, or one of my daughters. Right? In families, there's an awful lot of forgiveness, a lot of love, a lot of care. You give your kids far more than they probably ever appreciate, and probably more than they'll ever be able to give back. But you do that because of your relationship with them. There's actually an economy that works. Okay? It's an interaction which is an interaction of gift. And so even if your kids come home from, I don't know, primary school and give you some, bit of finger painting or something that they've done, mate, that's a reward which is worth all of the late nights and all of the, extra effort and whatnot that you do, right? But it's a gift economy. It's an economy of giving first in order that you get something back, maybe. You're not actually looking for the something back. You simply give it because there's a pleasure in giving, right? Now, you walk out the door of the morning.
Your parents have done that for you, reciprocating in society. So we might not be personally doing that person.
Yeah. But it comes down, and I mean, if we had more time, we could look at the idea of a gift economy. This idea of a gift economy, you'll actually Google that, and you'll find that there's a lot of work done on it. There's a lovely book by a chap by the name of Lester K. Little. Something in the medieval economy, I think. Lester K. Little, anyway. There's certainly a copy of it at Sydney Uni. But he sort of talks about the way that the gift economy, which was dominant in the medieval era, was replaced by the exchange economy or the contract economy, which is basically the modern economy, right? Yeah, you're right. It's not that you give because you're expecting someone to give back to exactly that person. You're basically putting into the system, and with the confidence the system is going to keep you going, right? It's actually far more efficient, far more effective. Okay, the story I was trying to get you to think about, okay, you guys, 10 years' time, okay, you're working, you're fabulously wealthy as property developers or whatever you're going to be, and you've got your 2.5 kids or 2.1 kids that I've kind of been recommending, and you get up in the morning, right, with inside your front door, you're practicing a gift economy. You go out to your office and you're in the contact economy. You're actually wanting to make the most profit, pay the lowest wages, charge the highest prices, all that sort of stuff, right? And so there's this tension that we're in between these two different economic worlds. And that's largely behind a lot of what's kind of happening here, that socialism is not a gift economy by any means. It is really a form of state capitalism, right? And the problem is that Marxism or capitalism and communism have far more in common than they have in opposition. They're both got to do with ripping off the other bloke. It's just that it's a matter of who you're organising with to actually sort of do it. Anyway, I'm probably getting a bit off topic there, so we better keep moving along. Okay, liberals and left and right. Okay. Oh, this is something which I found a bit of a giggle when I first came across it. The American War of Independence was fought by two armies, or between two armies. Both of them had the war cry liberty. You had the American liberals, who were left-wingers, wanting freedom from the, the limits of the economic interests of England. Excuse me. And you had the Brits, who were on the right, who wanted to exploit the English colonies for all they could get. And now today we've still got this idea of, to call someone a liberal in England means they're a right winger. To call them a liberal in America is to call them left winger. And to a certain extent, we're kind of all taking on the American definition these days. But really, traditionally, continental liberalism tended to be on the left. The Americans tended to adopt the continental liberalism. That's why the Americans have got the Statue of Liberty in the harbour there, because where they get it from? They got it from the French, right? And so the French and the Americans kind of, they share that, and they both hate, well, they used to hate the English. So it goes. Okay. Economic balance. The 1890, I've said a number of things happened in 1890, but the Australian Labor Party was formed. And the Australian Labor Party was really against both forms of liberalism. It certainly wasn't communist, so it didn't take on board the proud and Marxist kind of view, but it was also dead against the British liberalism, which was the proto-liberal party in Australia. And I would say that the Australian Labor Party back in the 1890s, in fact probably up until probably the 1940s, maybe a bit later, was a very honourable organisation and did an awful lot of good for Australia. But that's now ancient history. Early in the 1900s you have the Communist Revolution and so on. Let's look at... Now, one of the curious things about the middle of the 20th century, and now that's getting to be well outside of your lived experience, is that it was a very successful period economically. And we would say, it's all because of the technology and all the rest of it. But in fact, what was really happening was that it was the flourishing of a balance between two deathly enemies. You had the capitalists wanting to be absolutely rabid capitalists. And they were, trying to think if I find a polite word for it, but extremely scared of the socialists who were in the ascendancy from about 1917 when you had the Russian Revolution. Right? And so between 1917 and probably the end of the Reagan era, you had the capitalists too afraid to be capitalists, and the communists kind of, I would say that communism never really works as a system, but it was looking like it was through that period. And so the capitalists basically pulled their horns in, and there was considerable improvements, and that was mainly manifest through the reduction of wealth polarisation, relatively speaking. At the same time, we had a lot of technological development. Nothing like a world war to go and sort of help technology move ahead. But during that time, things were all sort of spinning along, and sort of year by year things were getting better and better. Largely because you had these two extremes kind of in some sort of an uneasy tension, right? Okay, we've got all that. Okay. To a certain extent, the story looks a bit like it fits with Marx's idea of conflict theory, doesn't it? Okay? And that's probably why it didn't work in the longer term. Eventually communism sort of fell on its face a bit, and we see the major, communist political entities, the USSR turning in the Russian Federation, is now post-communist, even though it's kind of formally kind of run by communists. Same thing with the Chinese to a certain extent. They're a giant capitalist country, run that way. Whether it's Marxist or not, I'm not sure. But there are a number of hidden losses. For those of you who have read Ruskin, Roots of Honour, if a professional is someone who will die rather than sort of lower their standards, which is now getting to be an old-fashioned idea, largely professionalism has been lost to us. To a certain extent, we're seeing a similar thing with patriotism. In fact, I'd say it's very, very parallel to the story I told about the end of Rome. Right? Now we've got the Blackwaters and the contractors sort of fighting, the American wars for them. because you can't really go to war anymore on the idea that God is behind you, or because there's some oppression. A lot of wars now are really trade wars. You end up with a larger level of, well, a lot of unfortunate things. For my sins, I did 2 years of sociology, which was fabulously interesting study, but in amongst that you find just how much of our social theory, certainly feminism, is just about all based on Marxist worldview, one way or another. Okay. Now, there's an author that I haven't mentioned, I think, in the slides. His name is Carl Zimmerman. His book was Family and Civilization, and it was published, I think, in 1947. Zimmerman was of the opinion that you could see the rising and falling of civilizations by their property rights and their family values. And what he would say is that civilizations rise on the back of strong family values and an appropriate sense of property rights, probably other things as well, it's sort of just price stuff that we've seen. But he would also say that they tend to fall, sort of demise, when you get property wrong and when you get family wrong. And I'd say that's pretty much what we're sort of seeing, in our part of history. In the past, when that's happened, usually some other culture comes along to basically recolonise the culture. We've seen it with the Germans. They sort of came in and recolonised the Western Roman Empire, introduced those things that had sort of fallen out of it, and eventually you had what was really the most productive and civilised era in Western history, which would be the medieval era. Now that's past, it's gone. We're now at a point where our technology is still kind of moving us ahead, but in many ways, many of our other social and civilizational values are now, to a certain extent, in eclipse. So we'd ask ourselves, if we apply Zimmerman's idea, where you say, okay, then the Greeks gave way to the Romans gave way to the Germans, and now the Germanic culture, which is really the West, is on its way out. Where do we look for a rising culture? Okay. To a certain extent, you can see kind of hints of what could do it, perhaps, in Europe, where the European generally are now too well off to want to do their menial jobs. And they're not having children, so to do their menial jobs, to wash up after them and to run their nursing homes and all the rest of it, they have to get migrant workers. And those migrant workers tend to come from a very non-Western kind of background, at present sort of often from the Islamic faith. Now, will they have the capacity to re-civilise Europe? Maybe your grandchildren might be able to answer that question because they'll be able to see it. Right now we can only just look around. If we want to look at what cultures could come in, typically they'll sort of come in to do the dirty jobs, working in the police force, working in the military, being the factory workers, uneducated or what have you. But eventually, if they have these strong values, property values, family values, civilizational values, then over time they'll rise up and become the cultural leaders and the economic leaders for that matter. So what can we look at? The values there are sort of not the individual but the community. Property wealth ordered to the common good rather than the individual good, things like that. Sense of solidarity. This notion of solidarity was a term which was kind of introduced into the debate, if you like, about a century or so ago, late 1800s. The idea that society works well when you have people operating in union in some way, rather than as individuals. It's probably no surprise that the USSR was toppled largely by processes that began with a Polish trade union. And what was its name? Solidarity. You see solidarity in the way that Indigenous people relate to each other. And this notion of social solidarity is extremely important. Social solidarity lives almost as the entire antithesis of individualism. And yet at present our society is based on the individual being everything. You know, when you pay tax, you pay it as an individual, you don't pay it as a family. If I approach an employer, I approach as an individual, and so on. I think we'll finish it there. We've covered an awful lot, because really what we've done, especially over these last 4 classes now, we've looked at a fair sweep of history, and I've tried to introduce you to the cultural dynamics that are that underlie the way that civilizations rise and fall, and the way that property rights are intimately connected with them, and the way that whenever you see property rights going, like a civilization going forward, is always on the back of a particular approach to real estate. Okay, I think we'll finish there.